All right, having some weird stuff go on with trying to tape this. It is taping, but it's very strange. What we're going to do today is I've sent all of you, as I often do, you've all got an email from me this morning that's got a folder in it. I'd like you to open up that folder, unzip it to your desktop, please, and then we'll take it from there. So it looks like this. It just says, as always, see the subject line. It should be called 11/14/2014. We're going to look at a couple of the things that are in here. In particular, what I want you to open up and take a look at, there's two different folders in it. And the folder that I want you to concentrate on for right now is called MPG-JS. I'd like you to open that. What we're going to do first today is we're going to build 3 versions of a miles per gallon program. All right, the first one is going to be very familiar to you. It's going to be pretty much the way that we've done it thus far. And then we're going to go and we're going to talk about other ways we could do the same thing. So in other words, the first one's going to have the alerts and all the other stuff. And then when we do the other ones, one's going to look like this, and the next one's going to look pretty much the same. All right. But one's going to be a jQuery and one's going to be a JavaScript. I want you to be introduced to the kind of the melding or merging of HTML with all of this other stuff. So that's, like I said, that's what we're going to be doing. But what I'd like you to do then is, if you notice, if you open up that MPG.js folder, you'll notice there's 2 other folders in it. And what you have in all of these folders is all the HTML and all the CSS that you need, but you don't have the JavaScript. So we're going to write the JavaScript as a class. So I'd like you to open up the first one that says 37 MPG original. I'd like you to open that up, and you'll notice if you look up on the screen here, there's just an HTML file in it. If I double click on it, it's pretty simple, but it doesn't do anything right now. All right? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start up your editor of choice, be it Notepad++, be it brackets or something else. And as I told you before, or maybe you didn't hear this if you walked in right as class started, they're working on the overhead. He's probably not going to be able to come back till Wednesday. And I've tried jacking with it this morning. I made it worse, then I made it back where it was, and then I made it worse again, but I haven't made it better. All right, so we're just going to have to work with it for the next couple days. All right, so I'm going to use, as I often do, Notepad++, and I'm going to start up a brand new file. All right, so this is what I want you to do. You don't have to turn this in, all right, but I will make a deal with you, and that deal is if you attempt to do this and get it to work, by the end of the period, I'll give you hard copies of everything that we're working on. All right, and I think that might be able to help you. I have to talk to Charles. I forgot to do that this morning because the roller on that cartridge is getting really bad, so it's not printing very well. It's like smudgy looking, but we got it. So that's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to just do a file, save as, and I'm going to save it into my folder, my 11/14/26 folder, MPG.js, and the original folder. All right, so I'm going to save it in there, and I'm just going to call it MPG.js. All right, and that gets us started. This program is not real long. I don't know how many lines it is, maybe 30 or 40 lines, but I want to make sure, because this is the last time I plan on going over a program like this that has basically the prompt, and then it has the alerts, etc. All right, so from now on, we're going to shift focus, and we're going to be using basically HTML forms. All right? Okay, so start out with a small comment here. Always kind of nice to let the user know what it is you're going to be doing. So this is project, and this is 3.7 out of that handout that I gave you last week. We're writing it 3 ways. All right? So create a web page that you can use to calculate miles per gallon using the following formula. Now, what we could do if we wanted to is we could ask the user for a lot of information. In other words, we could ask them for their starting mileage. So maybe it was 16,000 miles. Then we could ask them for their ending mileage. Maybe it was 16,400 miles. From there, we could figure out the amount of driving they did by taking the 16,400 minus 16,000. Does that make sense? We could do it that way. We're just going to basically ask, so we're going to say miles per gallon is going to be equal to, and we're going to ask them for the miles that they drove, so miles driven, and we're going to divide that by gallons used. Is that simple enough for everybody as far as what we're doing? That's going to minimize the inputs that we're going to have. Because the focus here is on the JavaScript. The focus is not on the inputs. Okay? All right. So I'm going to put another comment in here. One problem with performing the calculation is that if you attempt to divide by 0, you will receive, and I'm going to put in here an error. I'm going to put it in double quotes. Why? Because technically it's not an error, it's the not a number. Okay, we're going to get that, or we're going to get INF, which means infinity. For this reason, constants will be used to keep this from happening. And again, I've said this to you before, I want to say it again. Newer versions of browsers will allow us to use the word const like this. It's not a problem. Older versions of browsers, so if you find somebody who's still using IE6, IE7, or has a real old version of Firefox or something, there might be problems with this. Does that make sense? We're not going, that's not what we're going to be concerned with right now. We could make it a var, and if we made it a var, then that wouldn't happen. All right, if we just made it a var, it would work fine then. But I don't want to do it that way. All right, so I'm going to say min miles equal 1, max miles equal 1,000, min gallons equal 1, now, you're not turning this in, so when I put these comments in, whether you put them in or not, it's up to you. But you should get used to commenting your code, and you should get used to commenting your code when you write it. Please don't delude yourself into saying, well, I'm gonna put the comments in, but I'll do it after I get done doing all my code. Typically, you don't do that because you've got other things that are more important to you than to do that. Plus, it's best to comment while you're creating because then it's fresh in your mind. All right. So I'm just going to say here, minimum miles driven. maximum miles driven, minimum gallons used, and maximum gallons used. All right, if I want, I can come down here and I can put a comment in that says declare, if I can spell, declare and initialize program constants. I'm asking you this question now. When we set this up, do all 4 of those lines make sense to everyone? Do you understand why we're using constants? It makes our program more self-documenting. All right. All right. So then we'll have a main. And we're going to try to be good programmers. So in other words, main should be our program driver. And again, I want you to start understanding when I use this verbiage, what I'm talking about. And what I mean here is ideally, we're going to write as little executable code in main as possible. Does that make sense to everyone? Main should be the supervisor. Main should be what's calling the other functions to do the work. So we're going to do that first, but then when we get done, we are going to ask the user, do you want to run the program again? So we'll put that part of it into a loop. All right, we're actually going to use in here, we got a loop and then we'll have an if. If I put an if statement, I'm asking you this, if I put an if statement inside of a while loop, if I put something inside of something else like that, what is it known as? Nested. You all got that right to my knowledge on the test. So you know this stuff. It's one thing to memorize it for a test. It's another thing to actually see it in practice. All right? So I'm going to have this variable that I'm going to call again. And I'm going to set that equal to true. And I'm going to have another variable that's going to be called first. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll do this one. I've been using wanna, I don't know why, but I'm going to do that anyway. Now, these variables, this is going to be the program continue flag. Again, you all know this. Boolean variables can only have a value of true or false, right? In fact, a lot of times, rather than again, people will oftentimes in their code use a name like flag. I used again because it is pretty indicative of what I want to do. Do you want to run a program again? So I called it again. I could have called it again flag if I wanted to. All right? So that's the program continue flag. This is going to be the answer to run program again or not. And again, ideally, they're going to put a Y or an N in there. Does that make sense to everybody? Again, we can ask you, do you want to run the program again? And we can ask you to put in a Y or an N, but that doesn't preclude you from putting in yes or no or leaving it blank or whatever. All right? We can try to make it as easy for the person running the program as possible, but there's only so much that we can do. All right? So this will be just the first character of wanna above. So in other words, if we say, do you want to run the program again, and they say yes, then first will just be the Y from the word yes. All right? All that makes sense? All right, so we're going to put this whole thing into a loop. While again. And I've told you this before. This is a shortcut for, somebody tell me, that while again, what is that a shortcut for? Well, you should know this stuff. What are we testing right there? Whether again is what? True or not? So that's a shortcut for saying while I gotta put my fingers on the right keys. While, again, equal, equal, true. Now, a lot of times when you're first starting to learn to code, that's the way people will write it. Instead of saying while again, they'll say this. If that's easier for you, then do it that way. You would literally never do it that way as an actual programmer. Why would I want to type in that many characters when I only have to type in that many? All right? So this is saying as long as this again flag that we've already set to true, as long as it is true, do everything that's inside of here. Does that make sense? All right, so what do we want to do? Well, miles equal input miles driven gallons. Yes. Okay, and that's a real good question. The question is, why wouldn't you, you're saying right here, right? Okay, the main difference between a while loop and an if statement is an if statement is what I call a one-time shot. All right? So I ask you your age, okay? And I need a number. And you say none of your business. Okay? Which means I'm going to get NaN, right? If I put it into a while loop, I'm going to ask you again. All right? And if I put it into an if, I'm going to ask you again. But I ask you again. I put it in an if and I ask you again. And you still say none of your business. So now I'm out of there. But with a while, you keep the person in where you want them to be until they put in what you want them to put in. All right? So typically you use looping for input validation. You use while if it's a single check. You know, so you've entered a grade. If it's 90 to 100, it's an A. That would be an if. All right? All that makes sense? All right, and it's a good question. So here we're going to also call input, no, not there. So this will be called input gallons used. And again, you're all smart people, so I know you all realize this. I didn't have to call these miles and gallons. I could have called it miles driven. I could have called it gallons used, all right, etc. I could have done all that stuff. I call this miles because up here I'm using miles. And now up here, even though I'm using gals, I called it gallons anyway. But the point is, use names that are at least somewhat reflective of what you want the variable to hold. Don't just use M there, and don't just use G there. They're just not good names. So I've got the first two things. Now, it's nothing wrong with using MPG because most people do understand that. Most people do understand what that means. Here's kind of a litmus test for you, all right? I have no idea, well, I'll just use myself, okay? Let's suppose that my wife came down for the weekend to visit me and she happens to look at this code that's right here, all right? Ideally, at least, what we've written so far is written in a way that even though she doesn't have any idea how to code, she could figure out what each one of these routines is supposed to be doing. Would you agree with that? That's pretty much, if you use good variable names and you use good names for your functions, methods, whatever they happen to be, your code is much more self-documenting. You should always strive for that. Sometimes you end up with bigger variable names or longer names for your functions, but it still makes the program easier for other people to look at and figure out what you're trying to do. Would you agree looking at these two lines, these two? They both have to return a value. Would everybody agree with that? Because we're stuffing the first one into miles and the second one into gallons, right? Would you agree with both of those? We're not passing anything in, so there are no parameters. Would you agree with that? All right. How about this one? Would you agree that we're returning a value here? And we're going to stuff that value into MPG. But that function that we've yet to write that's called calculate MPG, in order to do its thing, it's going to need miles, it's going to need gallons, and we didn't have to do it this way, but I'm passing in MPG also. So in other words, when I create this routine right here, I'm going to say function input miles driven paren. I'm going to say function input gallons used paren. I'm going to say function calculate MPG and either give it those names or maybe just, maybe I'll use M for miles, G for gallons in MPG. And for the last one, this is not returning anything, correct? But it's going to require these three things be passed to it. Now, if you understood all those, you are on your way to understanding this. All right, because those are some of the hallmarks, those are some of the most important parts of understanding this. Because whether you're working in this language or one of the languages that we end up using in the next few semesters, it's all working the same way. We could go back next semester, maybe we will. Maybe on the first day of the semester in spring, we'll go and write this exact program and we'll write it in C# so you can see the difference. All right? But you're going to almost, I'm not going to say be amazed, but kind of be surprised. It's going to look, wow, that looks almost identical. Except instead of using var here, for that one we'll use Boolean. Instead of using var here, we'll use string. And we'll use string and we'll use float or double here and here and here. Other than that, as far as I know, that could have been written almost identically, the same way that we've done it so far. All right? All right, so if we ran it now, nothing's going to happen because we haven't written any of these routines. But we're in a loop right now, and we have to give the user the chance to get out of that loop. If we set up a loop where the user can't get out, what kind of loop is that? What? You got it. Again, you all got that right on the test. You know this stuff, but it's one thing to memorize something for a test. It's another thing to be able to write it in code. I've said this before. This isn't meant to be funny. It's not funny. Amin gets a job. No one's going to come in there and say, Amin, would you please define an infinite loop for me? The chances of that happening are not very good once he gets a job. And let's face it, if he's out on a Friday night, it's probably not going to work that well with the ladies either. All right, hey, you want to know what an infinite loop is? They probably don't care. All right, but you have to know how to use this stuff in order to be able to program effectively and correctly. All right, so what we want to do is we want to give them the chance to run the program again. All right, so I'm going to say that wanna, do you want to run it again, equal prompt, do you wish to run the program again? First equal wanna dot char add, and we're going to go over every line of this. So if it looks funky, we're going to go over all of it. We've talked about it a little bit, but I want to make sure you see it. About 3 more lines to type in. So I'll give you a second to type all that in. Let me move this up a little bit. Like I said, sorry for the resolution.
In the if statement, could the y have double quotes around it? Or
Yeah, it doesn't matter. You can put single quotes here if you're more comfortable. You can put double quotes. Either one's fine. What you're going to find, no, it's a good question. What you're going to find in most of the other languages, if you use single quotes, then all you can put in there is a single character. The field has to be of type char, C-H-A-R.
Right.
All right? But in here it doesn't matter, so you could do it either way, whatever way you're comfortable. Anything that we've done in here in double quotes could be put in single quotes. All right? I'm typically and I didn't even realize I use singles there, but I typically use double quotes because usually that's what's used in most programming languages. Now we're done writing main, but I want to go over it and and I'll give you a chance. So if you're still typing it in, I'll let you type it in or finish it up. Now, if you look up on the screen, this is going to almost look weird, but what I'm going to do here, I don't want you to do this, but what I'm going to do here is this. I'm going to comment these out. I don't want you to do this, but I'm going to comment, I'm going to comment all of these out. These are all of our function calls. Why am I doing that? Because now, if I come in here and I run this, do you wish to run it again? Do you wish to run it again? I'm in a loop, but that's working. That's what I wanted to show you. That's working. And the reason right now that it's not doing anything, it's twofold. First, I commented everything out, and I commented everything out because I haven't written it yet. But I am able to go in there and test that part of the program. In fact, the only thing I didn't test, if you looked at it, do I want to run it again? Yes. Do I want to run it again? No. That got me out. So all that works. That's good. All right? And again, I don't want to take anything for granted. So am I right in supposing everything? I'm going to uncomment these now one at a time. Am I right in assuming everything we've gone over thus far makes sense to you? All right? Because you are going to get a test that's going to be similar to this one, and I think it's going to be Thursday, but you're going to have a problem that's going to be similar to this. All right? But I want to make sure you understand the logic. All right, so the next one we want to write then is this input miles driven. So I'm out of main right now. Again, if it makes it easier, and I don't know, I'm not you. So if it makes it easier, sometimes it does for people, to put in comments in here, because if you notice, we're starting to have a lot of curly braces. So if that makes it easier for you to understand, then do it. If it makes it harder for you to understand, in all seriousness, don't do it. I don't know. Because like I said, everybody in here is different. And I've had students who've told me in the past, well, when you do that, it starts to look like a green sea, so to speak. There's so many comments in there, it's hard for me to see and pluck out what goes with what, etc. I would never take off points for over-commenting. All right? And I probably told you this, but just in case I didn't, I was working at this company that worked, it was in the aerospace industry. All right? I was a programmer analyst for them. I knew I wasn't going to stay. It wasn't the place for me. It was not a good fit. All right? But I had to write this system for them that was very, very complex. I actually impressed myself because I didn't think I could do it. I had to ask a guy for a little bit of help to get started, but after that I did every bit of it myself, and it worked. All right, but again, the thing was in the vicinity of 5,000 lines of code. But out of those 5,000 lines, about 2,000 of them were comments. I put whole program runs in there so they could see what was going on. Did it slow the program down? Of course it did. But it wasn't that kind of program. They had to run it at midnight every night to see it was for certain orders from a certain company. All right? And again, maybe I told you about this before. I don't remember. But I do remember that when the guy who ended up taking over for me, I asked him to look at it. I gave him all the code. I wish I'd have kept it, although it was proprietary. I just wish I'd have kept it. But I asked him the next day, I said, Mark, did it make sense to you? And he said, you put so much documentation in there, how could it not make sense? He said, hell, a supervisor could read it and understand it. That's why you comment. All right? Okay, so now we're going to write our routine to do our miles driven. And the good news is, by and large, our miles driven and our gallons used are virtually the same routine. Does that make sense? Except for miles driven, it's got to be between 1 and 1,000, and gallons used, it has to be between 1 and 100. But other than that, it's pretty much the same routine. Okay? So I decided to come in here and write this a little different than some of the ways I've shown you before. I'm going to call this invalid miles driven, and I'm going to set it equal to true. And I've got another variable in here called MD for miles driven, and I'm going to set that equal to 0.0. All right? And this is going to go back. This is going to go back kind of into the same thing that Tiffany asked about before. You could ask almost the same question. I'm going to use two while loops. I'm going to have a while within a while. And you might say, well, why didn't you use ifs? Again, we could have, but that would have only handled it for the first time. So if we would have put invalid input in, and then we tell them it's invalid, and they put invalid input, that's okay. But human nature says sometimes you ask someone to do something, they do it wrong, you ask them to do it again, and they still do it wrong. All right? So we're going to use two loops in here. So the first one is going to be while invalid miles driven. And this almost looks a little weird. Hopefully, it'll make sense in just a second, okay? Now, when you write code, there are so many different ways of writing it. Again, another quick analogy. Maybe I've given you this before, but imagine that when you came in here, you were not taking an IT class. All right, you came in here at night, and let's say it was a class. My sister-in-law took one of these. She was telling my wife about it. Her and her daughter took it, and I guess they're especially they're yuppies. That if you're a yuppie, it's kind of a popular class. They call it art and wine. So you learn to paint, but you also have wine while you're doing it. I don't know if that's really a good combination, all right? But that's what they do. Okay, so let's assume we're going to have one of those classes here, and I'm your teacher. Let's forget the wine part, but we're going to have a painting thing. So the first day you come in here, I come in and plop right down here. I put this bowl of fruit down. There's a banana, there's an orange, there's some grapes, and a lemon, let's say. Okay, so that's it. And I say, now, I want to see where you all are in your artistic careers. I'm going to walk out and walk back to my office for an hour. When I come back, I'm going to look at what you've done. You can draw it, you can paint it, and Amin raises his hand, well, what do you want? No, I want your interpretation of it. Would you agree that all of you could do something totally different? All right. Maybe Evan looked at it and really saw the grapes back from where he is. So that's all he had, and he really accentuated that, etc. The reason I'm telling you that, it's the same way when you program. Two people can look at the exact same problem and come up with totally different ways of solving it. Each way is exactly correct. So it's not that, don't look, well, which way's better? That's not what you look at. The bottom line is, do both ways of doing it solve the problem? And if they do, well, what can you look at? Well, if one of them takes 50 lines and one of them takes 5 lines, I'd rather do the one that takes 5 lines. All right? I mean, if I'm going taking a trip back to Illinois, all right, I can actually do it and only take about 4 highways and get to my house. I'd rather do that, but if I really wanted to, if I wanted to sightsee and whatever, I could go pull out a map or a GPS or whatever and take a bunch of back roads. I could do that. I drove to Canada with a friend years ago, and when we drove back, that's how we drove back. We took a 1-day trip and made it into a 3-day trip, but we saw all this really cool stuff. All right? But it's really important that you realize there's many different ways of doing the same thing. One way, and the way I used here, I'm assuming that the number, that whatever you put in for miles driven was invalid. What does that mean? That means I'm assuming that the number you put in was either less than 1 or greater than 1,000 or wasn't numeric. Does that make sense? I'm assuming that. Some people, what they like to do instead is they would have this called valid miles driven, and they'd set it to true, and they'd check for not or something like that. So there's so many different ways that you can do this. This just happens to be the way that I did it. All right? So I'm going to grab this prompt statement in here. And we have this variable called MD for miles driven. And it's going to be equal to, well, we want to parse float on our prompt here. And we want to say enter miles driven. All right? Now, we can be nice here and we can say, for example, 1 to 1,000. Kind of a nice thing to do, isn't it? You know, just to let them know what they're supposed to put in. If I wanted to, I could also make this a lot longer, and that's the way I did it in mine. I could say that it has to be between, and I could use min miles and max miles. All right? But right now, okay, right now, it'll work fine the way it is. Do you also now understand this part right here? If you look up on the screen, this part, everything that you see in gray, that's the prompt. That's going to result on the screen with the prompt dialog that says enter miles driven, and then in parentheses 1, 1,000, and then it'll have, in the box where you put the input, it'll have this 100. That's the default value. So this is the string you want to show. That's your default value. And then when we get done, we're going to attempt to convert that to a number. All right? But remember, when we attempt to convert that to a number, it might not be. There's four possible things that can happen. One, the best thing, you put in a number between 1 and 1,000. That's good. Then we're done. All right? Number two, you leave it blank or you put in something non-numeric. That's going to give us NaN. Not good. Number three, we could put in a number that's 0 or less. Not good. Number four, we could put in a number 1,001 or more. Not good. Does that make sense? Those are the four things that could possibly happen. So we're going to write another while loop inside of here right now that's going to handle 3 of those 4. All right? And so I'm going to say here, I'm going to put a comment in that says validate miles driven. All right? And how are we going to do that? We're going to put in a big while loop. Oops, I don't want to, sorry. I didn't think I wanted that. There we go. Now, right now, that's going to handle that one condition. So if we put something in there that's non-numeric, that'll handle it. All right? But we still have to handle our other 2 conditions. So, or the miles driven is less than min miles. That's going to handle 0 and negative numbers. Or the miles driven is greater than max miles. That's going to handle everything that is over 1,000. Yes.
No, she's got one on the end.
Well, I can always check this way. See that? So that one's going with that one. All right. This one's going with that one. That's good. These 2 are together. Those 2 are together. And these 2 are together. It looks like it's right. Now make sure that you have this in parentheses on yours. All right. Does it make sense that what we're checking are those 3 error conditions? Non-numeric, out of range negative, out of range positive. So if that's the case, all right, I'm going to put an alert in here that says invalid miles driven inputted. All right. And then I'm just going to ask them to do it all over again. And the last thing that I want to do in here is once I get out of this loop, that invalid miles driven, okay, once I get out of here, I want to say now it's true. I'm going to give you some time to put this in. That's the whole routine right there. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to put that in. I'll move that up in just a second. Does everything that's in here, right there, that's in gray, does that all make sense to people? This is your chance to ask. All right? Because I said I want to make sure that it does make sense to you. So now we're inside of here. So let me move it up here. This is our validation that's taking place right in here. We are keeping them in that code until they put in a number that is between 1 and 100. Because if they don't, if it's either non-numeric or if it's out of range, they're going to be given an error message and asked to do it again. Does that make sense? All right. Let me save this. Okay. Now, I'll come right back to the program. But now we've got miles, driven. So let's just do an alert here that says, whoops, that says miles driven equals, you don't have to do this. I'm going to get rid of it later anyway. Miles. All right, so let me run it and see if what we've done so far works. Input miles driven. Put in some junk. Invalid. Do it again. All right. Well, it's got to be between 1 and 1,000. Let's try 0. Invalid. Good. All right. Let's try something that's over 1,000. 1,001. You see how now what I just quickly did was I checked all three of our possible error conditions. All right. One thing you may or may not be aware of in here. This is my question to you. Is that valid or is that invalid? In every programming language other than JavaScript that I know of, that's invalid. That's valid to JavaScript. As long as you start with numbers, as soon as it finds something non-numeric, it throws it away. But if I'd said ABC 100, then it would be an error. All right, so if I hit enter, all right, still doesn't like something, not sure exactly what it is. All right, so I know that there's some kind of a problem in there. All right, but I do know that at least what it's doing in here right now in this code is I know that it is coming in here and it's making that check. All right, so if it's not numeric or it's less than the minimum or it's greater than the maximum, all right. Just looking at it, I don't know what the problem is, but we'll see if we can figure it out in just a second. What I'm asking is, does everything that's in there make sense? Because when I get done and we get this to work, I'm going to take this whole routine here, I'm going to grab all of it, I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, I'm going to paste it in again, and that's going to become my gallons used. But I'm just going to change miles driven to gallons used. Other than that, it's the same routine. And you find that a lot when you're writing code, is that a lot of the stuff you do is very similar. So let's see, while invalid miles driven, float prompt, huh.
For line 34,
Uh-huh.
when it says chart add, what does that mean?
Oh, this, yeah, we didn't really go over that before. That means just grab the first character. All right, but we'll go back and look at that in just a bit. All right. So I'm trying to figure out now, let's see. So it says here we put in something invalid. I'm going to grab that alert that I put in there. Okay. And I'm going to try to run this again. It's not even getting into that. So there's something that's in here that's hosing this thing up. Because there's something that no matter what, it did not even get to this line right here. Oh, I guess I should try to put that above that one. There. So there's 100. It's not even printing out that line. I don't know what the problem here is. All right, what does that mean? It means we go back and keep debugging it until we figure out what the problem is. I'm wondering if it's not even getting into the loop, if it's just coming up and doing this one again. Notice this line right here and this line right here are identical. I'm just going to put here, just for now, because I want to see if, when I run it, if it's the first one that's running over and over again or the second one. There's the CCCC. See that? It's not even getting into my other loop. Something is hosed right now in the program. So MD equals this. That was var MD equals 0, 0. That was fine. That looks okay. Look at my own code here. I'll tell you what, I guess the way it works out, it's 9. Let's take 10 minutes. All right? And then we'll come back and I'll see if during that time I can figure out what the problem is. That's it. I think that was it. Let's see.
Do you need the true on the line? Or wouldn't that
That's what I'm looking at.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
It should have been false.
Yeah. I was
That's what it was.
confused.
Yep. That's okay. Live and learn.
You want that to be false because that means that it went right.
I want it to be false because that means that that's going to get us out of the outer loop.
Right.
My program isn't even coming on when I go to run it.
All right. Okay, I can come over there in just a minute.
Did you save it as like a regular MPG
Yeah.
JS or Do you want us to add the alert that tells us what, that tells us like miles driven equals this? Or
You can, but you don't have to.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Okay. So, if it's good then, it'll just take and not, come up with anything then?
Yes.
Okay.
And you typically use that when you're debugging,
Right, yeah.
you know, but other than that, you wouldn't have it in there.